Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started here. Thanks for joining us this morning for Policy Insiders today. We're particularly pleased to welcome this morning Congressman Darrell Issa of California, representing, among other places, San Diego, ranking member on the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. Before we get started, let me direct your attention to your tables. There are question cards on the tables. Please write any questions that you have for Congressman Issa on the cards, and a member of the chamber staff will collect them while he is making his remarks. Congressman Issa was elected to Congress in November of 2000 and represents, as I said, the 49th District of California. As ranking member of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, Congressman Issa has been an advocate for oversight of government contracting and the procurement process, studying the effects of the financial markets and TARP implementation and the logistics of the decennial census. Congressman Issa also, of course, serves on the House Judiciary Committee. Prior to his tenure in the Congress, Congressman Issa served in the U.S. Army, achieving the rank of captain. He subsequently founded Directed Electronics, Inc., which is famous for its Viper car theft alarm system, which became North America's largest aftermarket automotive electronics manufacturer. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Congressman Darrell Issa.
Sometimes in life, remembering your friends when you get an opportunity is the greatest joy you have. So with your indulgence, I might note that Gary Shapiro is writing questions that we'll try not to have read. For those who don't know, Gary and I worked together when I was president of the Consumer Electronics Association, which was then part of the Electronic Industries Alliance. And usually in my resume, that's the part that they feature is, speaking to any business association, that I'd risen through the ranks of the business association, which means, like several of you in the audience, I worked for free for Gary. Now, in fairness, Gary does mention I was on his compensation committee, which is how he grew to know and like me. It is a pleasure to be here today, and it's a pleasure for a particular reason. This town is abuzz about change, and we do need change. We need change like General Motors needed change, like Chrysler needed change, like a lot of industry, including our financial sector, needed change. Because like anything in life, when human beings are involved, there will be tendencies to go a direction that seems good at the time. You get well invested in that direction, and one day you wake up and say that wasn't the right direction. Some might think that we've been going the direction that the Titanic was going, the speed the Titanic was going, and now that we've hit an iceberg, our theory is that we should in fact have gone faster and we might have beat the icebergs and not been hit. We are in that exact situation. We are dealing with a number of really, really dangerous, perhaps devastating problems in our economy. We have hit an iceberg. We have, in fact, and I'm not going to dwell only on the TARP and on the stimulus and on, if you will, everything we're trying to do post last September, but for a moment, let's ask the real question, which is, does anyone here disagree that, in fact, we got into an unsustainable economic model in which greater and greater leverage drove up the price of homes and other real estate assets with less and less skin in the game, all based on the assumption that the exit was at a higher price for the property? Seeing none, the good news is in Washington, if you can agree on the problem, you're 1/4 of the way to the solution. Now here's the problem that remains. There are two basic solutions. We can admit that, in fact, business was wrong, government support was wrong, and in fact, government messages sent by the Congress and by the administration were a major part of the problem. Or we can assume that government was right, business was evil, and this would not have happened had we had the appropriate oversight and regulations. Today I'd like to, and I'd love to take your questions on a myriad of subjects, but I'd like to enlist all of you to make that decision as we go forward, not just in the economic model, but in the healthcare model, in each of these models, because the question is the same. The answer that we have to deal with will be based on the same question, the same two roads that we could take. In 1992, Congress directed HUD to create quotas for Fannie and Freddie, basically saying in no uncertain terms, we must serve the underserved, we must find a way to give loans to people who would not otherwise qualify. At the height, $1.9 trillion worth of no-document cheater loans, as they're sometimes called, and subprime loans had been bought by those organizations. I don't know what you all think, but to me, that looks like the single greatest. It was about 54% of the total subprime market passed through those two organizations. To me, that seems like significant government involvement. And yet today, we're not talking in terms of fixing a model that was led by government. Lest you think that I'm only a Republican congressman, every time and I'm not the greatest economist, I didn't foresee all the problems, but I have a 28-year-old who was looking to buy a home the last 3 or 4 years, and he kept telling me prices were going up, and I said, yes, but prices are already too high, thinking there might be a small correction. So I watched the market, and I also watched President Bush. And for the last 5 years of his administration, on a regular basis, more than once, more than twice a year, President Bush would get up and brag about the highest level of home ownership in history. So the problem of government not seeing that an unsustainable rise driven by too easy credit was in fact government-driven and government-supported. We could get into Greenspan, Bernanke, and any number of other people who saw the same thing and seemed to see the sunny side and not the shady side of the problem. Having said that, I am the ranking member on government reform and oversight, so what I tend to do is I tend to talk in terms of reform. I also tend to talk, hopefully always, in terms of what can we do to have the transparency so that others can reform. Today, briefly, I'd like to make sure that if you're not already looking at XBRL as a technology and my piece of legislation, 2392, which is co-authored with Ed Towns, the chairman, then you're missing something, which is that this entire debacle that we saw could have been mitigated by vast amounts had we had a common platform of transparency in these types of economic deals. And for those who just want a brief tutor on it and save yourself Googling it, with XBRL, it's been demonstrated that you can look at an entire instrument, a credit default swap with all of the underlying products that were in the original bundled package, and you can find out, because the format demands a rigid discipline as to what you call something so that you can line up those cells to figure out what they all equal. If that had been implemented at Freddie and Fannie and at banks up and down the coast and around the country, as it has now been implemented ordered by the FDIC and the SEC, and I have to admit, by the SEC only after 4 years of work, concluded just after Chris Cox was leaving, but he deserves the credit for having been somebody who thought it was the right decision but couldn't get it done in a timely fashion. What would have happened is very quickly you would have looked at the documents and you would have said, what is this asset worth? And the answer would have been, what are all the underlying assets worth? How can we analyze each and every home to see what the underlying creditworthiness of the individual was, and assuming that it's not in default? And if it's in default, what is the asset worth? And based on what are the neighbors worth and so on. Believe it or not, we couldn't do that, but it was demonstrated that with a common protocol, we could have done it. Before the next time that some event occurs in which people are willing to sell something for 10 or 20 cents on the dollar, when clearly the underlying assets are worth 60 cents on the dollar or more, we need to have that in place. Mitigating that would have mitigated a host of problems that occurred. Additionally, my committee is going to continue, with Chairman Towns leading it, we're going to continue to look at some of the actions when we give government particularly the Fed, vast new authority, as we did in the case of the TARP. We're going to look at it because I believe mergers and acquisitions should be done, if they involve government, with government taking a relatively passive road, saying we stand ready to provide X or Y, bring us your proposals, and not a shotgun marriage the way we saw between Bank of America and Merrill Lynch. Last but not least, President Obama has called for a number of changes which I support. First of all, he believes, and I know I've spoken to some of the defense contractors here, he believes that inherently government work should be done by government employees, and I agree with him. We should not have a contract that is designed and let by one government contractor to other government contractors, thus eliminating, if you will, the consistency of an honest broker in the way of a federal employee who has no gain and has no participation in a company. Having said that, we do disagree on what is inherently governmental, and we disagree on how you get from not having the procurement expertise to write your own technical specs to having that. Today, the only area of government the only area of our economy that's growing at a very steady pace of 5 or 6% is our government. We're 130,000 net new employees in the federal government during a time in which we have gone from 4% unemployment to, in my state, 11.9% unemployment. We're going to have a health care debate on the House floor today, and that may tee up a few questions with all of you. We all agree that America spends more on health care than any other country in the world, first world, second world, doesn't matter. And in fact, we have 44 million uninsured and a host of underinsured. What we do disagree on between the administration and some of us in Congress is how do we get from where we are to where we would like to be, which is full capability for everyone to have quality health care delivered in an efficient and effective way. I believe that we're going to win in the long run. We're going to lose the first round for those who agree with me that if you want to have the same health care plan that members of Congress have, that's easy. Those health care plans are private. They operate without direct government aid. We know exactly how much the government puts in and how much we put in. That's the amazing thing for the American people is if you want the same health care I have, it's only a matter of opening up those programs to allow you to have them. It doesn't require that the government set up new industries. So when I'm going to answer questions, because there isn't enough time, even though you've been very generous with it, to go into details of each of those areas. But I think that we can have alternate ideas on health care that preserve the system while taking care of the inherent problems. We can't unring the bell on Chrysler, but we can today ask one real question, which is, if, in fact, General Motors became bankrupt as a result of poor management and a reliance on, if you will, deferring compensation, deferring everything out, so that ultimately what brought it down were its own legacy cost pushed forward to future generations, then are we doing anything different here in Washington but pushing forward debt and IOUs for Social Security, Medicare, and others? And if that's the case, then General Motors should be a model for how government needs to reform. Thank you. And if the first one's Gary Shapiro's, I won't be surprised. He's famous for it.
We'll make sure to call Gary's out specifically when we get it. A couple of procurement questions, Congressman. First of all, the acquisition workforce and the lack of training and numbers seems to be, that was a hard day's night, I think.
And just so you understand, for all of you that care about intellectual property, I own the CD, I ripped it myself, it's my tune.
Very good. No piracy issues there.
No piracy. It's fair use, right?
I think so.
Absolutely.
I tell my friends that.
Maybe you have a question about that, Gary.
Yes, he does.
The acquisition workforce and the lack of training and numbers seems to be a key area for many of the shortfalls in the federal procurement process. Do you agree with that? And what are your thoughts on the best way to go about fixing the lack of training and numbers in federal procurement?
Okay, and then we're going to assume that didn't come from Boeing, Lockheed, or any of my other friends. No, look, government procurement is broken, and I'm going to say it's broken for two reasons. One is September 11th caused us to suddenly have to develop a huge amount of new tools, particularly on the defense side, but also the Homeland Security side and so on. These were tools we didn't know about. We could not have long-term acquisition strategies for. We didn't have a model of what we were using and what we wanted to use next, and we didn't have the luxury of time. So I believe that you can say that's the best model for what we need to be prepared for the next time and are not. We looked and said, who has the expertise? And as you're probably well aware, what tended to happen was huge amounts of companies and people came forward with ideas, all of them good, some of them doable. And we muddled through that. We muddled through it for our soldiers. We certainly muddled through it for container evaluation for nuclear, biological, even conventional, and so on. Today, where we are, in my opinion, is Republicans led the charge to reduce the size of the federal workforce and said we'd get efficiencies. We discovered we're not very good at getting efficiencies in government. So, and particularly because of a number of failed software attempts that probably had more to do with our writing specs and then changing them along the way. I believe that there are two fixes for this. First of all, we need to change the whole incentive plan for the federal workforce. Make it a longer plan, an escalating plan that holds senior staff longer. Because we do have a tendency, and many of you in the audience, not the youngsters, but the ones my age, have a background of working on that side and then getting to a point where the government was telling you, based on your retirement plan, that you were better off quitting and getting another job in the private sector than remaining longer in your existing career. We need to change that message, which helps us retain longer and retain more senior staff. Having said that, that alone won't do it. The federal government will never be good at being a think tank. And if a think tank has to be part of the process of writing future specs, then there has to be middleware. And there is some, but I'd like to see a lot more of it, if you will. Organizations that are public-private, that are designed to not compete against industry, but be an asset of the federal government, work as nonprofit. Some of these can even be operated by private contractors, but their charter is for the public good. Some of the models at DOE, I think, are excellent, where you can recruit some of the finest minds, either adjacent to universities or sometimes in little unmarked buildings that nobody knows about, where you have all these PhDs helping us in the black world that I was fortunate enough to get to know when I was on the Intelligence Committee. That model is a good model, and those of you who know examples of it need to speak up that if you don't want to have procurement be all federal bureaucrats, and at the same time you don't want to see your prime or your sub suddenly be the person designing the contract that you have to compete for the next time, to where you have these conflicts of interest. That middleware needs to be really refined. I believe that both universities and other organizations are desperate to have an opportunity to be nonprofit partners, and then when we need to stretch, they can do more of the stretching without, if you will, the normal complication of a long-term relationship with the federal workforce.
Yeah. A lot of interest in Buy America, Congressman. Despite some mitigation of the harm from the original Buy America provision that showed up in the stimulus bill, there are nevertheless some worrisome protectionist rumblings, if you will, from many corners and parts of the Congress. What are your thoughts on the direction of Buy America now?
You know, with unions getting a majority of companies, even though they didn't have in bankruptcy a right to it, I would say that the chances of protectionism are high. Having said that, how do we beat protectionism in this element of change? I'm going to suggest something that's not on the table today, and that is that our tax code is inherently designed to make us less competitive than certain foreign countries in what we do. My old company has a Canadian subsidiary, their investment tax program, where everything we spend in R&D we get back in addition to the VAT consideration in our export, makes Canada a smarter place for us to put a lot of engineers. Likewise, if I import product from Canada, or let me rephrase it, if I import product from China, to use a more appropriate example, if I import product from China, I don't contribute to their social welfare program directly. I pay my product and it's their problem. And I also don't add any support of our social welfare program to those products, even if they displace American products. And that's a case for why is it most of the world has a VAT as a major part of their tax and we don't. I think we need to make the case not that we're undertaxed, trust me, we're fully taxed, but that either tax increases or even tax cuts need to be considered in light of shifting the momentum to where we naturally have peer or par level with our competitors. How do we deal with investment tax credit? Even the, quote, permanent investment or the permanent R&D credit pales in comparison to the deal I get in Canada. And when I buy product from Europe, or when product goes into Europe from my old company, I watch this VAT being added that ultimately pays for their social welfare, which normalizes my product to domestic product. We really haven't thought about the macroeconomics of that enough. So I try to tell people, I want people to buy American. I believe Americans can be competitive, but to be competitive, we should look at government's role in that first before we look at mandates. And that's where I lose some people, but I pick up some people that understand that to a certain extent businesses operate with one hand tied behind their back, and then they go to China and everyone says, aha, you've gone to China. Well, if you tell me to go to China from a policy standpoint and a dollar and cent standpoint, don't be surprised if I go to China. Hopefully we bring that message all the way back through the chamber that we want to produce here, help us be equally competitive.
Picking up on your comments on healthcare in your remarks, what is the first step or series of steps that Republicans could take or should take to promote a more efficient private health insurance market? For example, deductions or tax credits or any of the other ideas that are out there.
Well, Republicans absolutely should do something 4, 5, 6 years ago. Today, we're irrelevant, except for communication. So I'm going to be candid with you. Man, you know, how many of you remember Dirty Harry with Clint Eastwood and his famous line, "A man's got to know his limitations"? You all knew it even before we got there. I know some of you were thinking, do you feel lucky, punk, do you? But the fact is, we are strictly in the communications business. We are in the proposing of alternatives and hoping that some blue dogs and some other, if you will, alternative ideas can then be bought into by the Democrats. Some of them are fairly easy. If the government's going to preempt the private sector, the easiest preempt is to tell the states, and this is one that I'm trying to sell to Republicans, tell the states that they have to have a model for pre-existing condition exemption, if you will, in their state tax code, or we're not going to give them Medicaid money. Straightforward. Medicaid ends up paying for, in many cases, the uninsured. So the federal government is paying for your uninsured. Who are the uninsured? Many of them are people who can't get health care because they have a pre-existing condition. Thus, the federal government does have a legitimate, and I try to sell this to my Republicans. It's not the Democrats. They're happy to put a mandate in. It's the Republicans that are saying, oh, we can't preempt federalism. It's like, well, wait a second here. If you give money, you can put strings on the money. So one of the things that we're trying to put into the healthcare reform is there are a couple of things that could be done if the major healthcare reform fails. One of them is provide national access, provide an assigned risk pool, either by mandates to the states or even a federal assigned risk pool, but make sure that it's all in the private sector. You know, every company here is probably a large company. But if you look at the small companies of 20 employees or less, they desperately want better solutions that allow them to get into a reasonable size pool where they don't find themselves at a competitive disadvantage. And that's where an actual bill that we're going to propose, and it's not going to go anywhere, but we're going to propose and put out there, is one that simply says everyone has a right to sign up, every company, every individual, to sign up for any health care plan offered to federal workers. You'll be in a separate pool, because it doesn't surprise you the federal workers were a little concerned that we would change their risk pool. You'd be in a separate pool after the first year, but everybody could have that. Every one of those, of course, being a private plan that simply is being offered to the federal workforce.
Congressman, with respect to your work on the committee, you've been it's noted that you've been quite aggressive in requesting documents and whatnot from both business and government.
I have so many people who read better than I do, and they desperately want material.
Exactly, and you've been doing that without the support, for the most part, of your Democratic colleagues on the committee. Do you want to comment on the direction of your efforts and the success that you've had in that effort?
Well, sometimes the best way to make a point is to kill your foe with kindness. During the 2 years that Henry Waxman was in the minority with Tom Davis and I was on the committee, there was something called SID, and that program was 100% Henry Waxman doing investigations and releasing minority reports. I think he released 32 separate reports. He eventually got hearings on quite a few of those because the press picked them up. Republicans were in the majority in the House and the Senate, and there was a Republican president, and he was doing his investigations. Now, he did not normally, he had to work with whistleblowers, he had to work with people who would slip him papers, some of whom probably shouldn't have. Eventually, he got subpoenas on this stuff because he got enough information to shame or to encourage the Republicans into doing it. Sometimes he never asked us until after he'd already done this. We would have given him the subpoenas. Henry was not worried about the fact that he had no authority technically. And those 32 reports, I think, speak well for a model, which is, if you're going to have a majority of the president's party and they're going to naturally be reluctant to do investigations of him, do your own. Having said that, many of the investigations that I'm not getting cooperation on, probably at the orders of people above Ed Towns, I'm actually trying to investigate the Bush administration, but their fear is that it will lead to others. And if I can, I'll just give you one example. How many of you got a loan from Countrywide? Thank you. I'm glad to hear that there are people who will say, yeah, I did. Well, Countrywide had a program. Were you part of Friends of Angelo? I mean, they had this program. It's not a secret. I mean, Chris Dodd is being investigated by the Senate Ethics Committee specifically for having gotten a number of these at you can calculate it in the tens of thousands of dollars of savings, nearly $100,000 in savings as a result of these better deals than you got. I don't think you can get a rebate from Bank of America now because it's too late, but we are trying just to get the information on who all got it, what the goals were. We sort of know the goals, but how broad the program is, because this type of public corruption, and this is one member of Congress talking about Countrywide in the past tense. Angelo was not a Republican or a Democrat. You know, he gave this deal to the Postmaster General, who was a Republican appointee. He gave it to Republican staffers. They gave it specifically to anybody that could help them. And we're not getting subpoenas granted, even though during the Bush administration and Republicans being in charge of both houses, it's inevitable that more Republicans probably got the deal than Democrats. I think the problem is they're trying to protect specific Democrats who are still in office, who have not been outed. And our goal is not to out them. Our goal is to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And by the way, you know, if I'll pick on Boeing because they're at my table, but you know, if I could get a Boeing BBJ-2 and I could get it for $10 million instead of $42 million, do you think it would have an effect on how I would view Boeing? The airport closest to me is McClellan. You know, obviously, these deep discounts are clearly outside of what has historically been tracked, and it's exactly the kind of corruption that we had with Duke Cunningham and Bob Ney and other prominent Republicans who either are in jail or are soon to get out. And so that's an example where it confounds me that they're not willing to drain the swamp, both sides take their lumps, and make sure it doesn't happen again, because it is probably the biggest scandal since Abscon. And remember, that was a sting. This was not a sting. This was legitimate attempt and success in providing hundreds of thousands of dollars, perhaps millions of dollars, of unwarranted discounts to people simply because they were political influence gatherers. And I know I'm going like a senator, but Richard Holbrooke is a fine public servant. He was not in government. But this program was so broad that it included him. Why? Well, because he was incredibly smart, well thought of, and worked in the right circles. So one of the reasons we want the subpoena is we want to look at people who are out of government, who did nothing illegal, but who were being influenced that ultimately, when they went back to government or whatever, could have been influential. That kind of corruption has never even been covered. For how do you protect from that when you have a fine public servant who's left office, he's now back in office. He had no reason to suspect that Friends of Angelo was an attempt to sort of make him a mole for some future use, but it's clear they didn't give it to him just because he's smart.
Right. Speaking of Mr. Waxman, Congressman, it does look like the House is headed toward a floor vote on the ACES bill, or the Waxman-Markey climate bill. This is a rather large bill, 1,200 pages, that I think went to rules on Monday.
I thought you were talking about the trillions of dollars.
There's that aspect as well. And I think amendments are due tomorrow, and a vote is expected on Friday. Do you care to comment on any concerns you might have about members' ability to at least even just digest the bill, not to mention vote on it and vote to pass it?
Well, you know, we read faster than we did before. You know, it used to be 11 hours, 1,000 pages. We couldn't get it read, but all of us have gone and taken speed reading. Look, there really aren't going to be surprises in the intent of Waxman-Markey. What we think we can do, both through our amendments and a floor discussion, is get the American people to understand a little more that this is a new government tax system. It is a seizing of an amount of dollars. It is not what we have historically done in environmental issues, which is set goals, tell industry to figure out how they can achieve them. We'll have a number of amendments that try to point out that that you just have too many polluters using CO2 as pollution that produce too little, and the government has no ability to really maintain it. But on the big issue, they're going to make all but 30 or so members in the House on the Democratic side vote for it. I expect to have less than 10 Republicans vote for it, maybe as few as 0. We don't know right now. We've chosen not to whip that. But for all of you, the real question is, if CO2 is a pollutant, and if America is going to reduce it, then why in the world would we reduce it? And this goes back to Buy American for a minute. Why would we reduce it and have absolutely no control over whether a Boeing aircraft, if they can't meet that, or they 30–40% increase in the cost of electricity makes you not competitive? All you have to do is move your operation to another country that's doing no mitigation at all, and in fact, there's no carbon tax on the importation. My proposal is simple. Either address that now, or expect that after this becomes law, in its current form, if that happens, that the next step will be, in order to protect your companies, they will come back to you and they will talk about a form of carbon tax on import. Well, that's fine, but the WTO and others are going to say, wait a second here, we're going to end up in lawsuits, we're going to end up being told you can't do that. So what you're going to end up with is the 40% increase an attempt to protect American jobs from being exported that will probably fail, and that puts us back in that round of if you will, international competition over how to close your borders. So I'm telling people that that's the unintended consequence of, if you raise my electricity by 40%, I will find a way, not as an individual, I'm stuck, but as a business, I'll find a way to mitigate that. If that means that products and service or products go offshore, Americans will be unemployed, and the round of protectionism is almost inevitable. So that's the unintended consequence that Markey could care less about, and neither could Waxman. And quite frankly, they've never been free traders. So it doesn't hurt them if their next solution is tax imports.
Final question, Congressman, on EPA and what's going on over there. You've been one of the most outspoken members of Congress on EPA's attempts to use the Clean Air Act to regulate CO2 and greenhouse gases.
Or at least the courts demand that they find a way to.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Between endangerment finding and the California waiver and the joint CAFE rule, EPA seems to be running at full speed to go in that direction. How fast do you think that EPA intends to continue to move on this, and do you think it's at all possible to get EPA to step back from this ledge?
Well, having been in Washington a little while, and many of you having been here even longer, you know that they can turn on a dime if the president turns on a dime because Congress turns on a dime. So I would say, and I'm not campaigning here, but the next election will be crucial. If people go home who basically headed us down this road, supported it, are stuck with what EPA and this administration are trying to do, and we're at 11% unemployment, as I expect we may still be. I think this is one of those dips that there's no logical reason that we recover from very quickly. Then I think the election outcome causes a real change. There's nothing inherently requiring EPA to do this. Under the Bush administration, they were viewing that they had a much more limited role, and they would have liked to have had none. So this is a purely political decision. It's consistent with the control of the House, the Senate, and the administration, and it can change as fast as one election. I don't think public opinion is going to change it, because I believe that there's this belief that as we lead, and in the case of Waxman, as California leads, so goes America. As America goes, so goes the world. I think they're just wrong. Because for those of us who have traveled around the world, the rest of the world says, okay, we'll do what they do. We'll just do it 10 years later after we transfer this business to us, because there's not much harm in that, and it's our turn. So that's where I think by the next election, it will be a legitimate public debate issue in which the American people will see the connection between unreasonably getting ahead of the rest of the world. We're not talking about a pollutant that makes us cough. We're not talking about a pollutant that if you clean it up here, it's clean here, even if it's dirty somewhere else. And the American people are going to get that the total CO2 is not going to go down if we shut off a coal plant here and China turns one on in China. And by the way, I don't blame China for doing it. As ugly and dirty as Beijing was, they are an emerging economy that sees this as a golden opportunity. And by the way, the amazing thing is they were upset when they thought we might not do it. Because this is loaded into their 10% per year growth plan, that in fact there will be transfers for which they're gearing up. I didn't mention card check today. I don't think I ever come before a business group and don't get a question on card check. For everyone here, I won't comment further than to say it's not dead. It is real. There is a goal to change the balance of how workers can, if you will, be represented. And I think it's important for business to stay on top of that, that if you think General Motors was a success because of that relationship, then you would want to have universal unionization, including college students like France. If you think more like Sarkozy, that perhaps the 40-hour work week was not all bad and that students should get their education before they go on strike, then I think it's important that you never take that off your front burner of things that you really have to make sure the American people and your companies get, that this has to be something you're ready that could pop up again very quickly at any time.
Very good. Thank you so much, Congressman. Appreciate it. Thanks for your support.